Good morning and welcome to Norcal PTAC's webinar in partnership with the Inclusivity Project. This one's on certifications overview for Black-owned businesses, and we're very excited for what we've prepared today for you. And so thank you so much for joining us. As I mentioned, all the slides will be available to everyone later today, along with the recording. My name is James Forrest. I'm the program coordinator and a procurement specialist here at Norcal PTAC. I'll be sort of the MC today. Thomas Burns is going to be giving the main presentation. He's one of our excellent procurement specialists at Norcal PTAC. I'll talk about who we are in a second. And we have Chris Horton, who is the director of the Norcal Sbdc, the Small Business Development Center Inclusivity Project. So we're also very, very excited to have Chris. Thanks so much for joining us. I'll talk real quickly about PTACs. PTAC stands for Procurement Technical Assistance Center. There's about 96 of them across the country, and as you can see, there's about 7 in California alone. We are the green one in the upper left corner, or west, as we say when we're looking at maps. And we cover our service area. But some of your folks were in Sacramento and Southern California, as you can see, there's different PTACs all around. So basically what a PTAC does is it helps helps the local businesses compete and succeed in the government marketplace. So Sbdc, they can help with all sorts of general business advice, but we specifically laser focus on government contracting. So we'll talk about that in a second. All of our services don't cost anything. We're funded by federal, state, and local grants and contracts. And in the fiscal year 21, PTAC served over 56,000 clients across the country and helped them win more than $24 billion in government contracts and subcontracts. Norcal PTAC, we got our own share of that in our little service area here, which admittedly does include the whole Bay Area and then all up the coast. We helped our clients in 2021 win more than $500 million, the B, so $500 million in government contracts. So we're pretty proud of that figure, funneling resources into the pockets of mostly small businesses in our service area. How do we do it? Well, we do it in 3 basic core ways. The first is over on the right. I just want to get out of the way. We do resources and trainings, like webinars like the ones you're on today. We're always putting these on, and they're always free to join for anyone from anywhere. You don't need to be a client. So we hope you get a lot out of those. You can check our calendar. But really the bread and butter of what do we do for our clients is one-on-one counseling and custom bid matching. So in order to be a client, you have to have a business that's established and ready to go, a for-profit business looking to get into government contracting, and you need a primary location in this service area. So on the map here in green, one of these 15 counties you should have a primary location in. So if that is you, then you're welcome to apply for us. You can see our website there, norcalptac.org. You'll see a red Apply Now button at the top. Again, we're totally free. We're friendly. We're a nonprofit. We're not a government agency, so we can offer kind of third party of advice. We do get funding from them, but we have our own perspective on things. And with our counseling, we can connect you with a procurement specialist, and they can walk you through just about any process related to selling your goods and services to the government. And when I say government, I could mean a city, a local utility, the county, a tribal entity, an agency, the state of California, state of Wyoming, all sorts of different states, and of course the US federal government. And we can get you help get you your certifications, get you registered in SAM, do marketplace research, all sorts of things. And then our bid matching is a neat platform where we can set you up with a profile that basically scrapes the internet and finds opportunities that match the criteria that you've put in your profile with your procurement specialist. So you'll wake up in the morning with a list of RFPs, and you can go ahead and click on those hyperlinked and respond to them that same day if you'd like. It helps you stay ahead of everything. So that's who Norcal PTAC is. If you're not in our service area, you'll find a second link there, apptac-us. That'll have a listing of all the PTACs across the country. All right, so we're very excited and we're very thankful that Chris Horton has agreed to join for today to provide his immense expertise in this field. So Chris is the director of the Norcal Sbdc Inclusivity Project and a really friendly guy. So Chris, why don't you go ahead and just introduce yourself briefly and take it away.
Sure thing. Yeah, thank you, James, and thank you, Thomas, for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to be on this platform and talk with our guests. So as James said, my name's Chris Horton. I'm the director of the Inclusivity Project, and really the Inclusivity Project is here to support all. That's why it's named Inclusivity. But what our focus was, we've learned from media, from data, from agencies that a demographic that could really use some specific targeted efforts to support entrepreneurship is the Black and African American community. And so that caused us to look internally at how we can be first responders to helping out in the Black and African American community. So my background is in banking and finance, commercial lending, and then small business support. I'm a former president and CEO of a chamber of commerce. And so really, I love the collaboration and synergy between services that the chambers of commerce can provide and services that can be provided beyond that through the Sbdc network. Next slide. So when we look at this, what I want to do is I want to give you an opportunity, and you can go to the next slide, James. I want to give you where we're coming from. Where we're coming from with the Inclusivity Project is taking a look at where we are today in the communities around the Greater Bay Area, specifically for Norcal Sbdc, but across the country. And take a look back at where we were, and then where are we going, and how do we get there, and what vehicle are we going to use to get there to support small business. As we all know, small business is the engine of our economy across this country. Next slide. Something that really was profound to me and really motivated me and inspired me to really do this work that I'm doing, which was, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, there were more than 1 million Black and African American owned businesses across the country. And within 2 months of the COVID-19 pandemic being named a pandemic, we lost over 440,000. When I put that number out there, I asked people to stop and take us and pause and take a look at what that means. That means 440,000 households have now been disrupted because they don't know where their revenue source may be coming from, because the doors of these small micro and mini micro businesses have shut down. And so think about the lives of those employees, if they had employees, and think about the lives of those kids that these breadwinners were providing for. Next slide. This is something that's very powerful and should be encouraging to not only us as entrepreneurs, but the local economies and the local communities that we live in. So if you can imagine that $1.2 trillion African-American buying power, what that means, how it can help communities have, better roads, schools, housing, parks and rec, and retail and housing. So there's a significant opportunity that if we can embrace the Black and African-American entrepreneur, we can help their business enterprises thrive and be prosperous. That prosperity can help us to create communities that we all live, that we can all live, work, and play and raise our families in. So it's really an opportunity here. Next slide. So again, the motivation behind this is, Black and African Americans, face systemic and institutional barriers, challenges, right? And so what we want to do is be first responders. We want to roll our sleeves up and pull up along the side of you and really be able to help provide you with the tools, the resources, the information, and really the awareness of what's out there to help you with whatever challenges or opportunities present themselves to you. Next slide. So here's the challenge. The Inclusivity Project isn't challenging you, the entrepreneur. It's you, the entrepreneur, challenging this institution and this system called the Sbdc. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that we can provide technical assistance on an annual basis to 1,000 Black and African American entrepreneurs. We want to help to connect Black and African American entrepreneurs to $100 million in either debt or equity finance. Let me pause there and be very clear. We do not have a fund or a bank account with $100 million sitting in it to deploy and get out to you. We have financial institutions and organizations that we partner with for debt and equity financing that we can get you matched up with. And that's what that's the value we bring, is you bring to us what your need is, and we can identify which road you should go to accomplish that. We want to help start 100 new Black and African American businesses on an annual basis. And we really want 50% of them to be Black women-owned businesses. Next slide. So let's take a look at what we did accomplish in our first year. In our first year, we provided technical assistance to more than 2,600 Black and African American entrepreneurs. We've trained over 328 Black and African American founders in the basic business principles. So you were in ideation phase, hadn't launched your business just yet, and we helped you get your foundation established. We've laid the foundation for more than 753 companies to either seek and receive capital. And then we've, again, we have more than 100 Black and African American entrepreneurs in progress to actually launching and starting their business. So very successful first year. Next slide. As we move forward, we want to see that 2,600 number exceed 3,000 Black and African American entrepreneurs receiving technical assistance. We want to launch 200 Black and African American owned businesses. And again, 50% of them to be women owned Black and African American businesses, building a fund to have $100 million where we can control the deployment of those funds. Again, we're not a lender, we're not going to deploy it. We will have a relationship with financial institutions that do this all day, every day. And most importantly, at the end of the day, is we can help your business thrive and be prosperous, but we want that to holistically come over to you as an individual in your personal household, in your personal pursuit of happiness by helping you to create generational wealth and leaving a legacy. Next slide. So our commitment, we're committed to providing the support that's needed ongoing. As long as you have an opportunity, as long as you have a challenge, then you have the infrastructure of the Sbdc that can support you. So we're going to support you as an entrepreneur, and we're going to connect you with our community partners to help you with your personal pursuit of happiness as well. So we're planning to invest, like I say, and you see here, our time, our talent, and our resources to every community member within the Inclusivity Project community. Next slide. Looking ahead, we're looking to work with lenders to create a new paradigm as far as lending parameters. Traditionally, financial institutions look at, cash flow, collateral, credit, character, and conditions. We want to create a platform where we can look at you, the entrepreneur, your commitment, your dedication, your hard work, and your passion for what it is that you're doing, and be able to lend to that as opposed to traditional criteria. Working with community colleges to put on cohorts so that you can get the education that you need, helping the 100 Black entrepreneurs start their business, creating new initiatives to address issues that we find in our community that many times don't get addressed. We don't have conversations. We don't have an uncle or aunt or dad or mom that was an entrepreneur that we can go to, but we can come here to the Inclusivity Project and Norcal Sbdc. Next slide. Why Sbdc? Real in a nutshell, we are the largest business consulting firm in the world. And so we know what we're doing, we know how to do it, and we've been successful at doing it. We've been doing this since the early 70s and don't have any plans on going anywhere anytime soon. I really love the fact that these are services that you've already paid for with your taxpayer dollars. So it doesn't cost you anything other than raising your hand and saying, I need help or I would like help. Next slide. This just gives you an overview of organizations that share, the same determination and the same interest in supporting Black and African American entrepreneurs. So you got your National Association of Women Business Owners, the National Urban League, you have Norcal Financial Development Corporation, you got the Black Chambers of Commerce, you got financial institutions. So there's a number of organizations out there that are sharing and singing the same song with us. Next slide. Again, startup funding, James alluded to it earlier, federal funding, state funding, and then Cal State Humboldt State University also has helped launch with funding to start this initiative. Next slide. Yeah, basically here, all I'm saying is, listen, don't keep this a secret. If you know of entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs, tell them about the Inclusivity Project, tell them about PTAC, tell them about Sbdc. If you know of organizations that share a vision of wanting to support Black and African Americans, reach out and let us know so that we can reach out and contact them. And then, at the national level, there are many Sbdcs across the country that serve all different demographics, the LGBTQ, our Latinx, our Native Americans, the Asian Island Pacificers. So everyone can be a part of this. We all have dreams and aspirations. Doesn't matter what demographic we come from. Next slide. And this really sums it up. We must take this moment in time right now to start this movement, to create opportunities, and to give our trajectory a chance of thriving and being successful. I think that's the last slide, but we'll say next slide. There it is. Thank you all. Thank you, James. Thank you, Thomas, for allowing me to be here. If there are any questions now or at the end, I'll be here. Thank you.
I do have one brief question that came from Chris in our audience. They were wondering where you got the statistic for the 440,000 businesses closing their doors.
Yeah, that was a census that was done by UC Santa Cruz.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, sorry, CB, not Chris. Thanks, CB. Okay, great. So let's power along through. Thank you so much, Chris, for that introduction to the Inclusivity project. You guys are obviously doing amazing work. And now we have the rest of the main presentation is going to be given by Thomas Burns, who, like I said, is one of our procurement specialists. Thomas, we're so thankful to have you. So go ahead and take it from here.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated, Chris. Appreciate that. Okay, so yeah, hello everybody. My name is Thomas Burns. I'm a procurement specialist here with Norcal Cpuc. I come from more of the entrepreneurial side. I've been in this industry of supporting small businesses for over 20 years. I have a background with business planning, marketing, sales, and government contracting. And I was in the Air Force for 4 years. Let me go right into the disclosure page. As you know, when we give our webinars, we're doing our best to give you information based on the newest, most current information. But sometimes things change, the next day. And so some of this information that we're going to be listing could change by the time I give my webinar presentation. All right, so let's talk about the agenda and what we're going to cover for the remaining portion of this webinar.
Hey, Thomas, would you like to launch the poll by any chance, or do you want me to do that later?
Yeah, let's do it after this, I believe.
Okay, great. Just cue me. All right.
Okay. So why certifications exist in the first place. I'm going to cover a brief history surrounding the creation of certifications in federal contracting and how that provided incentives for state and local governments to do the same. I'm going to cover which federal certifications are ideal for Black-owned firms, and then talk about which certifications that are non-federal are ideal for Black-owned firms. Then we're going to go into some information that's going to talk about all the information that's covered. The links and resources that I used for this webinar will be available for you. And at the end, we'll do a recap and final questions. So yeah, James, I would like to do that first poll before we jump into why certifications exist.
Okay, great. I've just launched it. The first question is, are you registered in SAM? And the second question is, do you have any of the following certifications, some of the ones we're going to talk about today? So if you could just go ahead and briefly reply to that, and we'll share them out afterwards. And Thomas, if you'd like, you can.
Yeah, I'm going to continue while we're waiting on the poll. But so quick history. So the SBA was created in July 30th of 1953 by President Eisenhower with the signing of the Small Business Act. So by establishing the SBA, this was the beginning of the federal government looking at the disparity of how federal dollars are really being spent with businesses of all sizes and types. So then by 1954, the SBA started making direct loans to select small businesses across the country. Now, of course, in 1954, discrimination was still extremely high, and Black-owned firms were not allowed access to these loans. So the SBA's first real effort at increasing business opportunities for Black Americans and other minorities came from President Lyndon Johnson And then it started also with Richard Nixon. So both of these presidents laid the foundation for the present 8A program. So first, Johnson created what's called a Test Cities program, and it involved a small-scale use of the SBA's authority under what's called Section Section 8A, to award contracts to firms willing to locate in urban areas and hire unemployed individuals, predominantly Black Americans, or sponsor minority-owned businesses by providing capital or management assistance. But under this program, small businesses didn't really have the ability to really receive subcontracts under Section 8. So what President Nixon did, he expanded the program to make it specifically for minority-owned small businesses. And during the Nixon administration, the SBA created what's called the Origination of the 8A program. So in 1970, the first of these regulations that articulated the SBA's policy of using Section 8A to assist small business concerns owned by disadvantaged persons to become self-sufficient, viable businesses capable of competing effectively in the marketplace. Unfortunately, though, the SBA lacked explicit authority for focusing the 8A program on minority-owned businesses until 1978. So it wasn't until 78 where Congress amended the Small Business Act and they gave the SBA express statutory authority for the 8A program for minority-owned businesses. Now, under this 1978 amendment, under this amendment, they were now able to subcontract, and award directly to socially and economically disadvantaged small businesses, and also firms that they had to also be minority, 51% owned. And so now let's bring this back to the present, right? So now, 2020, the federal government awarded a record $145 billion in prime contracts to small businesses. They did this by utilizing certifications in a way to make this possible. A good example of this is every federal government establishes formal goals to ensure that small businesses get their share of work. So anytime the federal government is going to purchase something between $10,000 and $250,000 is automatically created as a set aside for small businesses, as long as there are at least 2 companies that can provide that product or service at a fair and reasonable price. All right, so let me, James, I'm having a little bit of trouble moving to the next slide. Give me a second.
Should be able to click on the screen
Okay.
to be established. There we go.
There we go.
Want to get to that poll or?
Yes, please.
Okay, yeah, and I just want to apologize. There's no, I set up the poll in their, the second question, I meant to make it optional, but it is not optional. So I indicated that if you still wanted to submit, but you didn't have any of those certifications, you could just put the federal SB, which is barely a certification at all. So go ahead and click federal SB if you're trying to submit, but you don't actually have any certifications. It'll skew our data a bit, but it could be worse. Okay, I'll go ahead and end here, and I'll share the results out. So looks like about half of you are registered in SAM, half of you aren't, and about a sixth are working on it. So absolutely got a lot of folks working on being registered in SAM. And with a grain of salt, looks like about 40% of you are SB certified with the federal government. No one is Sdbe, Small Disadvantaged Business certified. 6 of you, 10%, are Hubzone certified. 2, about 3%, 8A. 19 Dbe, so that's a nice figure to see. We like to see disadvantaged business enterprises here. And then we've got the MBE through the Cpuc, and we got 18% of you are certified for that. So That's great. Thanks so much for playing our little game show today.
All right, perfect, perfect. And so this goes right into this next slide, right? So what I want to talk about is, so I'm going to cover the small business, small disadvantaged business, historically underutilized business zone, Hubzone, the 8A business development program. It's more than a certification. It's an actual program, disadvantaged business enterprise, and the minority business enterprise. This next slide breaks it down a little bit so you can see which ones are federal, which ones are non-federal. So now let's talk about the self-certification SB. So we did this poll, and so I do my hourly consultations with new businesses that are entering, either they're entering wanting to do business with government, or they've been doing business with government and they need help. And one of the things that comes up the most is when I ask them, are they registered in SAM? They say yes. And then I ask them, okay, so did you set it up so that you are a self-certified small business? And most of the time, they don't know what I'm talking about. So when you do your SAM registration, there is a section where you talk about your next code, you talk about your ethnicity, and the size of your business. Those are the questions that allow you to become self-certified within SAM, and SBA recognizes this. So it's one of the things that I have to make aware to a lot of people, that they already have a federal certification under the SB or SDB certified, depending on the agency. For example, in the SAM, it's called a SDB. On the SBA website, it's referred to as SB small business. So there's a little bit of a just confusion there, but that's its means of self-certified. Here are the benefits. So as it talks about, this is one of those certifications that's utilized the most when the federal government is looking to do business and treating a small business as a prime contractor. Excuse me, I'm developing a son of a sore throat. Again, I mentioned 145 billion in prime contracts awarded to small business firms in 2020. A big portion of that is coming from this category, the self-certifying small businesses. The only real challenge is that there are so many self-certifying small businesses competing for the same set-asides, sole source, or subcontracting opportunities. I don't know the exact number. It could be hundreds and hundreds of thousands of self-certifying small businesses that are within the SAM database that are also competing for those contracts. I don't have the numbers, but it's huge. And where to apply is, of course, sam.gov. You go to sam.gov, and when you register your firm to do business with the federal government, that's the process also to get self-certified. And this slide has some of the other information. For example, to qualify, you have to be 51% owner. So if you're a firm with 3 or more people, if you're the one that's putting in for the certification, you've got to be 51% owner. Of course, if all of your members of the company are all of the same ethnic group, you're all Black Americans, then yes, of course, it's not a problem at that point. But the key to this is you don't have to qualify via an application process where you have to prove all this information. You don't have to submit tax returns and all this other information. It's self-certifying. They're taking you on your word as you answer the information the information within sam.gov. So information about individuals having a net worth. Again, you don't have to prove it. You just state whether you do or you do not. And again, same information, the 23% of prime contracts for self-certified SB firms. Questions on this section, which deals with self-certifying small business firms?
We've had some questions. I've been typing some responses here. Folks were asking how much government contracting certifications cost, and I let them know.
Oh, they're free.
They're all free.
They're all free, yes.
That's a really nice.
Any certification that has a cost to it is a private organization. That's the easiest way to answer that question.
That's right, yeah. Okay, and folks were wondering about NAICS codes. It's North American Industry Classification System codes.
And I believe on our resource page, we have a link to the NAICS codes, but we'll get to that. But I believe we do have that.
I dropped a link as well.
Okay.
Kiriki is asking if there's eligibility for higher net worth than 750K for the small disadvantaged business certification.
Yeah, we will cover that. We will cover that as we go through our presentation.
For the SDB or for a different certification?
It's a different certification.
For a different certification, yeah. So for the SDB, you have to be under 750.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Look, we are getting some. So if you could put your questions in the Q&A, it's a little easier to track. Alicia is asking if you could specify what industry should get what government certifications.
Okay. Well, I would say it this way. All industries should look at certifications as an opportunity to enhance your ability to be competitive and do business with the government, whether that's federal, state, city, county, school districts, any government entity that you want to do business with, regardless of your industry, a certification helps you to achieve that goal. It's not a slam dunk, it doesn't guarantee, but it definitely helps open doors. So it doesn't matter what industry.
Okay. We see a question here from Lisa Duffy saying, missed the explanation of 8A, but that is coming up later. So maybe you're referring that the SDB and the 8A have the same eligibility criteria. So we'll talk more about those eligibility criteria under the 8A section. Kiriki is saying thanks. To clarify on which certs we are eligible for us, what I am looking for. Kiriki, maybe we can take that question offline. Feel free to email us at info@norcalptech.org and we'll see what we can do. All right. So as Thomas mentioned, regardless of your industry, it's more about the agency you want to do business with. So I'm going to disregard in other industry questions here. All right, let's keep things rolling along here, Thomas. Thank you.
All right, now we're going to talk about Hubzone certification. The certifying agency is the Small Business Administration. And once again, I feel compelled to give a little bit of history or background. So the Hubzone, or historically underutilized business zone, is a designated area of the United States where there hasn't been as much support for small businesses in the past, right? So the Hubzone, and how did they come up with the Hubzone map and everything? Well, it all starts with redlining. So redlining, as you know, is the illegal practice of denying racial and ethnic minorities access to banking, insurance, healthcare, retail, and other services. And the term originated from putting red lines on a map to highlight regions where Black people would not have access to financial services, irrespective of their income or creditworthiness. The federal government and banks prohibited granting student loans, consumer loans, commercial, home, automotive, and personal loans by refusing them outright or just increasing interest rates. Now, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act of 1975, and the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977 all work to put a stop to these discriminatory lending practices against Black Americans. So basically, when the Hubzone came out and they wanted to create a map, they were looking at the urban communities where this had been done, and that's how the Hubzone maps were created. They wanted to effectively start the process of correcting the wrongs of the past by using this as a certification to identify those areas. Now, quickly, they expanded this map, right? So when you look on this map, as you can see right here, it covers a lot of different areas. For example, the red, anytime you see red, that means it's a county. So certain counties have been, excuse me, created as a hub zone because it now goes into rural communities. So it's not just urban communities, it's rural, underprivileged communities. It's also Indian tracts, which is the blue areas are Indian tracts, and the other tracts are what they call census tracts based on census data. And so let's talk about the eligibility real quick. As you can see, the company's office must be located within a hub zone, and at least 35% of the employees must also live within that hub zone. The company must be a small business under the primary NAICS code, and it has to be 51% owned and controlled by a U.S. Citizen. The benefits. So across the board, for the most part, there might be a few agencies that offer a higher percentage of their own budget, but for the most part, 3% is the point where, so if a budget for a federal agency is $100 million, 3% of their budget has to go towards hub zone businesses that are located in hub zones. So that's what you're showing here is saying the 13 billion. So it's far shy of the total 145 billion, but it still has teeth. It's still a valuable certification that can help businesses that are located within a hub zone. And then we have the where to apply link. And remember, this webinar is an overview. And so Norcal Cpuc, we have many different webinars that we've done in the past that go into deep detail about the hub zone certification, how to apply, all the questions. This is just to kind of give you an overview, but we look forward to anybody who wants to go after the hub zone certification. They need assistance. Please, we've got webinars on the Norcal Cpuc site, or reach out and we can help you directly. Now, this map shows the San Francisco Bay Area, and as you can see, any area that's in gray is a, excuse me, is a hub zone area. It's kind of hard to see, it's kind of small, but again, you'll be getting these slides so you can, have a closer look. And then we're going to go into the 8A Business Development Program. All right, so this is the most popular certification, in my opinion, when it comes to the research and everything for African Americans and the federal government, because as I kind of talked about when I first started, this is the program that started it all. Right, the 8A program is the original creation of certifications because it does more than just offer an opportunity based on your, it does more than just give you the certification. It also provides training and assistance. That's why it's a program. It does a lot more than just give you that certification. The requirements, again, you must be a member of a disadvantaged group, 51% owned and controlled, must be a U.S. citizen. Now, the benefits, it is a 9-year program. But in my research, one of the things I learned about this, it takes a while for 8A firms to really get the full advantage of this program. It takes anywhere from 2 to 4 years before they start to see really consistent contracts from this program. So understand that this 9-year program, it's a great opportunity for any business that is serious about doing business with the federal government because of the training, the assistance, and the fact that it's giving you 9 years to make the most of this program. The only, and again, that would be the only challenge, but yeah, it's a powerful program. And I encourage anybody that's really looking to do business with the federal government to look at this program seriously. So this is just a blow up of that small slide. And then I'm going to go to the next slide real quick. Control eligibility, other requirements. So there's a lot of details involved with being certified within the, to get to pass the certification for the 8A program. And again, we are going to be doing another webinar, and James is going to talk about at the end of this webinar when that next one's going to be, but it's going to be in a couple of weeks. But we're going to do a full webinar just on the 8A program. And I like this slide. This slide gives you an idea of the history and where we are now, at least over the last 4 or 5 years, of federal spending based on different federal certifications. So you see the Hubzone is pretty much across the board, although they've had years where it's been 2% instead of 3%. So they struggle to meet that 3% goal across the entire federal government landscape. But you see the small disadvantaged business, that is the SBA's definition of the 8A program. So I want to be clear, and I left a link that takes you directly to the press release that is laying this out within the SBA's website. So I can see sometimes they go far beyond the 5% goal. And then under small business, which is that self-certifying one, you can see it's getting the lion's share. Any questions before we go to the next section?
Yeah, we do have some questions here. Adonia is asking, if I understand, if I'm still employed, supposedly somewhere else, I presume, while starting my business, do I not qualify as a 51% owner, minority owner of the business? Is that correct?
If you're still employed. So I guess what you're trying to say, meaning you have a company, but you also are working for another employer, that would not disqualify you. What they're talking about is the business that you are operating. Are you 51% owner operator of that firm?
Mm-hmm. Right. Correct. Yeah. Okay. So that is the first question. Adonia had a follow-up question, which I thought was really great. If I can't be employed while working to start my business, what options do I have to qualify for some kind of funding assistance? But that would be a question that's probably better for Chris Horton than for us, because Norcal Ptech, we don't assist with funding startup assistance. We only assist with you actually getting government contracts, but the funding.
Right, but I definitely don't want to leave the impression that you can't have an employment with another company while you're running your business. Mm-hmm. I didn't mean to leave that impression, because that's not true at all. 20-year entrepreneur, I've had many independent contractor or employment while I'm also starting my company. So that doesn't bar you at all.
Yeah.
That's not a restriction from getting any certification.
Chris, do you have any comment on startup assistance that might be available for a minority-owned business in that?
Absolutely. Yeah, we have a number of different organizations that we work with, so feel free to reach out. I'll put my information in the chat, but we work with a number of organizations that specifically focus on startup financing. So yeah, I'll put my information in the chat.
Awesome, thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. Ari Takata Vasquez is asking, can you explain what the 9-year commitment looks like? Is there an expectation that you grow out of the program for 8A?
There definitely is an expectation that you grow out of the program. Yes, their goal is that at the end of the 9 years, your business has elevated and achieved certain numbers, certain financial success, that you are graduated out of the program. And the webinar coming up will give you a lot more details on that, but I do know that yes, they want you to graduate out of the program. And that's why it's a 9-year, because they know the first year, 2 or 3 years is just building those relationships with the different federal agencies, the buyers, the small business specialists, all those different individuals that are part of the process of helping the 8A firm receive those set-aside contracts.
Absolutely.
Or subcontracting opportunities.
And that webinar will be on August 18th, 2 Thursdays from today. And that's going to be us continuing our Black Business Month series. I just want to note to William, yes, the recording will be available. It's going to go on our website. I'll drop the link, but we'll also email you if you registered today. Jackie is asking, if a company intends on applying for 8A, what can we do ahead of time to prepare in order to shorten the time it takes to contracts? Maybe we could just redirect Jackie towards the webinar in a couple weeks. Would you think that's a good idea?
Yeah, definitely.
All right.
Because there's a great deal of paperwork, so let's
a great deal of
definitely attend that webinar to get an idea of the paperwork involved that you have to start compiling. Yes,
absolutely. Yeah. So a lot of those 8A questions, you can email us, but you can also wait a couple weeks. Our procurement specialist, Mary Jo Juarez, is going to be doing a deep dive into them. So thank you so much for all questions. Let's keep it moving.
All right. So DBE. Disadvantaged Business Enterprise. That's what it stands for. Certifying agency is the California Department of Transportation. However, this is a partnership between the federal government and California, but in reality, all states that accept federal funds for road construction, bridge construction, or any construction that involves interstate commerce have their own DBE program, very similar to the program that's in California. The eligibility requirements are personal net worth of 1.3 million, so it's a little higher here. Small business is based again on NAICS codes. You have to be socially and economically disadvantaged, must again be 51% owned and controlled. So again, this certification and is ideal if your business has anything related to construction and trucking. That includes plumbing, that includes landscaping, that includes janitorial in many ways. It's a really broad category. So again, we're having a deep dive webinar on the DBE certification also towards I think that's the last one we're going to do towards that last week of August, where they will cover in great detail those firms that ideally should be a part of this. But look at your business, and if you're any way involved in construction, this is, and you do business here in California, then the DBE certification is ideal for you. One of the biggest challenges, and I think it's a challenge that just for any certification, really, it's a huge database of businesses that are already DBE certified. And that list grows every month. You know, for example, with the signing of some of the omnibus bill, along with other bills that have come out recently and may even come out in the next 2-3 years, there is a huge push of federal dollars going into California to improve our roads, improve our bridges, improve anything related to interstate commerce. So the opportunity for contracting is going to just continue to grow in the state of California. And so the opportunities are there, but the competition is growing just as those opportunities and those dollars are growing in our state. And where to apply, we left a link that goes directly to the application. This next slide breaks down what they call districts, right? Caltrans has these different districts throughout the state. And if you're in the Bay Area, you're in District 4. But again, it doesn't mean you can do business wherever you're located within California. If you're located in District 11, you can do business in District 4. But they break it down. They break it down into districts, and each district has their own set of construction projects. They have their own set of projects that are going on every single month. And this handout is one of the ones that's listed on our website, Norcal PTAC's website, that gives you a really good breakdown of what's required in terms of documentation for the DBE certification. Excuse me. All right, let's go to the next slide. And we're going to talk about the Nbe certification. Nbe stands for Minority Business Enterprise Certification. And the certifying agency is the California Public Utilities Commission, or they created an entity called the Supplier Clearinghouse. They're the ones that take the applications and do all the work of creating the certification and awarding certifications. Now, the reason this is listed as an ideal certification for Black-owned firms, it's similar to the 8A in that the original emphasis of why they wanted this program was to affect change based on things that have happened in the past, specifically towards the Black community and the Black community here in California. So basically in 1988, the California Public Utilities Commission issued what's called a General Order 156 that required all investor-owned electric, gas, water, and telecommunication utility companies with revenue exceeding 15 million to develop and implement programs to increase the utilization of Black-owned firms. And that's how the Supplier Clearinghouse was created. Right now, the goals are 5% for women business enterprises, 15% for minority business enterprises, and then that was, and then they included 1.5 for veteran business enterprises, 1% for LGBT business enterprises, and persons with disabilities. So let's look at the eligibility requirements for this one. Now, as you can see, they cover even a nonprofit, or certain nonprofits can also be certified under the Supplier Clearinghouse certification. It does not need to be located in California. You can be in Nevada, you can be in Arizona. No restrictions on the size of the business. So here's one of those certifications where there is no dollar amount based on your personal net worth. You just have to be part of a socioeconomic class and fit these other criteria. Actually, this is one of the certifications that I had for about a 7-year period when I was an entrepreneur. And I found it extremely useful, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But the challenges are, it is a lengthy process. It does take 90 days. And in fact, when I was doing the research on this for 2022, they are backlogged. So it could take even longer than 90 days if you were to submit all of your documentation tomorrow for the application within the supplier clearinghouse. It could take 90+ days to be awarded your certification because there are so many firms that are looking to receive certifications because of what's going on in California. Now, this slide gives you a list of all the participating utilities. And the reason I wanted to have this slide in here is because in my own personal experience, now, again, this is just my personal, but I found greater success with the water companies than I did with the larger utility companies. And the reason for that was I had a faster access to the supplier diversity managers and to the buyers. A little bit smaller organization, so it was a little bit less red tape, a little bit easier for me to get my capability statement to these buyers and these supplier diversity managers, and end up having presentations and end up getting contracts. So I particularly had success with the water companies, San Jose Water Company, excuse me, California Water Service were two of the ones. I also had some success with Southwest Gas and Southern California Edison Company, although it took a while. But yeah, this certification is powerful because all of these utilities, they use the same products and services as any state agency or any federal agency uses. So they require a lot of things, and they spend a lot of money with small businesses. Any questions on the DBE or the Supplier Clearinghouse MBE certification?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a nicely engaged audience here. Ari, yeah, it's great. Ari is asking, I think this was during the DBE section, does the DBE include technical skills like architectural design related to building?
Definitely, yes. Yes, it does.
All right. And then anonymous attendees asking, what about reciprocity between states for the DBE programs?
I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I think that will be a great question for the upcoming webinar. I don't know if you need to, for example, if you have a DBE certification in California, does that transcend over to the state of Arizona, the state of Texas, or do you have to also be applied and get a DBE in that state? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I think I remember hearing that it may be a situation where having a DBE certification in California may help fast track or make a smaller addendum for getting DBE certified in other states. But I don't think it's I don't think you can just start working in another state with a California DBE. I do think you have to do some extra paperwork, but that it may help that you already have a DBE certification.
Common sense says that it should be a quick process, but you know, I don't want to give the impression that it's definitely that way. You know, there might be something, and then each state has their own set of rules. So what's going on in the state of Texas may not be going on in Virginia. You know.
Mm-hmm. I thought you were going to say you didn't want to give the sense that common sense reigns in government contracting.
Well, we already kind of know that, so
we already know that a bit. It comes part and parcel with bureaucracy. Okay, do percentages of the MBE add together? For example, Black woman, LGBTQ plus.
Oh, yeah. Does it? I don't think their reporting does it that way. So I was just giving you the facts based on their website and how their procurement goals, I don't think they would do, you get a higher advantage per se if you're a Black woman. It's an Nbe certification, and then that covers all of those. Now they have the 5% for women business enterprises, and then 15% for minority business enterprises. And what that means is, so as an example, the San Jose Water Company, if their total budget is $500 million in terms of what they spend, then 5% of that, they want to, excuse me, they want to do business with women business enterprises. 15%, they want to do business with minority business enterprises. 1% is veteran and 1% is LGBTQ. So it's broken down in that way.
All right, great. And just to note that we are running a little late today. If you have to jump off now, just remember that you will get the slides later. I'll drop a survey in the chat today so you can let us know how you felt about today's webinar. But let's, well, we do have a couple more questions here. How long do these certifications last?
Okay.
Is there a slide that reflects that?
Yeah, the DBE, I am not exactly sure, to be honest with you. The MBE with Supplier Clearinghouse, you have to renew it every 3 years.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And does the CPUC help for primarily construction contracts, or is it helpful for services and other things as well?
So the DBE certification is for firms who are within the construction arena. The Supplier Clearinghouse is any firm. So let me make that clear. So the utility firms purchase a lot of different products, and that's why those links and that list is very important, because you want to go to each one of those websites and look at what they're primarily buying. But they focus on a lot of things. It's not just construction. In fact, my business at the time, I was a baker. I had a bakery, but I focused on wholesale accounts. I didn't really focus on retail. I focused on wholesale accounts, and I did a lot of catering. I did a lot of different large parties, and that's how I was able to get in with some of these utility companies, because they had a need. They had a need they had conventions, they had different events, and my business qualified as a service that they needed. And they jumped at the idea of utilizing a MBE certified firm to provide this service.
Great. All right, let's go ahead and take her on home.
Okay. So this slide here, I only wanted to include this slide just to give you an idea of what's happened in the last 4 years, right? Everything from COVID and the tragedies that have happened in our communities, and the rise of Black Lives Matter, and how that has impacted corporate America and government. And what this slide shows is that there has been a huge increase in the number of corporations that have implemented their own supplier diversity initiatives and programs. And that has also transcended into the government. So whether it's your local city, your county, school district, your state, and of course the federal government, they've all had a major push towards doing more to work with small businesses and definitely Black-owned firms as a way to bridge the gap, be a part of the community in a more meaningful way. I just wanted to share this information to show that there is a positive move within government and within corporate America to do more business with Black-owned business. And then I wanted to offer all the information that we talked about. There are links that we've left that give you much more information. Didn't know if I was going to go through every single one of these, but I think the key ones are there. If you want to apply for certification for anything I talked about, those links are here. Information on the Omnibus Amendment Bill that's talking about the increase in federal spending, and especially how they're going to increase the amount of contracting opportunities for small businesses is listed there. And then let's do a final recap. One of the things I want to really be clear is the opportunity for certifications is real, but you really want to take the time to figure out which certifications are right for your business. Instead of having the mindset of, I'm going to get all of them, I think it would be a better use of your time to examine the certifications, which ones are ideal for my type of business, and then look at it from that standpoint. Remember, they don't necessarily increase your chance of winning contracts explicitly. It's more about opening doors. You still have a lot of competition. Like when, for example, when the federal government says that between $10,000 and $250,000, those contracts are automatically set aside. So let's say they set aside some for 8A, they set aside some for the self-certifying small businesses and Hubzone. You still have thousands of firms that have these certifications that are competing for that set aside contract. So it doesn't mean they're setting aside just for you. It means they're setting it aside just for that certification, and there's still competition. Okay, James, you want to talk about our upcoming events?
Yeah, we are a bit over time here, so I'll make it really quick, but this is just the first webinar in a 3-part series for Black Business Month. And as we promised, we're going to dive much deeper into the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise, DBE certification, as well as the Dbe program. So the next webinar we have is on Thursday the 18th, same time, 10 in the morning, and the next one's Thursday, August 25th. So we're excited to get those started. I believe that we are all out of time for questions, but we've had a ton of great questions from the audience. Thank you so much, everyone. Just a fun little tidbit here. D. Hoffman in the audience said, thanks for sharing that you had a baking business applied for the Nbe cert. I thought I didn't qualify for that cert because I have a baking business as well. Now I'll look into it. So.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of different businesses that can qualify. The government buys so many things. I have a client here in Norcal, Cpuc. He makes a hot sauce, and he's now selling that hot sauce directly into federal and state prison institutions, which is being sold on the commissary by inmates, and it's taking off.
All right. Well, that's
just another example.
You never know where you're going to find success. So.
Right.
Everybody needs hot sauce, says Kenya. That's absolutely right. I can't buy it fast enough. It's leaving my fridge. I just dropped a link in the chat. That is our satisfaction survey. Just let us know how you felt about today's webinar. It matters a lot to us. We always want to improve our services, and it matters to our funder too. So that's a nice thing to do for us. You can do it anonymously if you'd like. Thanks again. Again, everyone's going to be getting these slides with all the resource links, all the hyperlinks there. You're also going to get this video that we're recording right now. It's going to go on YouTube, posted to our website. And huge thanks for Chris Horton for joining us from the Inclusivity Project. Thank you so much, Chris.
You're welcome, my friend.
All right, and Thomas, thanks for putting all the research into it, and getting this done across the finish line. And thanks for everyone. We're going to try to get those slides out to everyone tomorrow. So.
Good job, guys.
All right. Have a great day, everybody.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.